All right, let's do this. We're diving deep into IVAs today. Individual Voluntary Arrangements. You guys want to figure out how those things work in the UK, when they're useful, what to watch out for.
Right.
We got you covered.
That's right. We've got a great article from Corporate Debt Recovery Limited. It's called Understanding Individual Voluntary Arrangements, published in July this year.
So when we talk about IVAs, what are we talking about really? Like, I feel like I've heard the term, but I need like a little refresher. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So in the UK, if you're having some trouble with debt, an IVA can really be a lifeline. It's a legally binding agreement between you and whoever you owe money to, your creditors. It helps you restructure your debt to make it a bit more manageable. And hopefully it will help you avoid bankruptcy.
Okay. So it's a way to like get a hold of your debt before having to resort to, those more extreme measures.
Yeah.
But how does the restructuring actually happen? Like, walk me through it. As if I'm like sitting across from you and I'm like feeling all those bills.
Yeah. Okay. So the first thing you'd want to do is get in touch with an insolvency practitioner. They're usually called an IP. And you can kind of think of them as like a financial mediator. They'll assess your income, expenses, assets, kind of the whole picture to see if an IVA is even, on the table for you.
So they don't just like hand out IVAs to anyone who asks, There's like a whole vetting process. So say the IP gives you the green light. What happens next?
Then they get to work creating a repayment plan that's personalized, tailored to your situation. It lays out how much you pay each month and for how long. That's usually 5 or 6 years. It's about finding that sweet spot where you can keep up with the payments and your creditors get back at least, a decent chunk of what you owe.
So it's like a balancing act between you being able to afford it and then being okay with it. So does that mean that the IP makes this plan and that's it? The creditors have no say?
No. They get a say. The IP will present the plan to them, to all the creditors, and they vote on it. And for the IVA to go ahead, it needs a certain majority to agree. It can be a bit tricky because different creditors might have different, priorities. But the IP's there to kind of shepherd the whole thing, negotiate on your behalf.
Gotcha. So there's some real strategy going on here. It's not just like you fill out a form and poosh, you get an IVA.
Yeah.
But what kind of debts are we even talking about here? Does it cover everything?
Yeah, that's a good question. The answer is no. IVAs are specifically designed for what are called unsecured debts. So those are debts that aren't tied to a specific asset. So like credit cards, personal loans, overdrafts, those would fall under that category. But things like your mortgage or a car loan, which are tied to your house or your car, those are handled differently.
Right. So it's important to know the difference, know the rules of the game before you start playing. You mentioned earlier that you need to owe money to at least 2 creditors for an IVA to even be an option. Are there any other requirements?
Yeah, you need to be a UK resident because the whole legal framework is specific to the UK. And the total debt you have, that needs to be at least £6,000. That makes sure that the IVA is like a proportional solution, It's for debts that really warrant that kind of setup.
So there are some boxes to tick before you even think about going down this road. Makes me wonder, though, is there an advantage to this formal route with the IP and negotiating with all the creditors versus, trying to just work something out yourself?
There are some advantages, yeah. Probably the biggest one is the legal protection it gives you. Once that IVA is in place, your creditors have to stick to it legally. They can't harass you, call you nonstop, send you letters, try to take legal action. It can be a huge relief, if you're feeling that pressure.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That alone can be life-changing. I can see how that would be, tempting. But let's be real. There's got to be some downsides. Nothing's free, right?
You're right. Nothing's free. And the biggest downside, you have to know, is the hit to your credit rating. An IVA stays on your record for 6 years. And that can make it, a lot harder to get loans, mortgages, even to rent a place sometimes. That's a big one.
6 years. That's not just a little blip. That's a serious consideration. How do you even weigh that kind of long-term impact against the immediate relief an IVA might bring?
And that's where that's where they really come in. A good IP, they're going to help you weigh those pros and cons, really taking into account your situation, your long-term goals. They'll be upfront about the challenges, not just, the good stuff.
Right. So finding a good IP, that's key. Someone who's not just pushing you towards an IVA, but actually wants to figure out the best path for you. So, okay, let's dig into these pros and cons a little bit more. What else should people be thinking about when they're, looking at this IVA thing? So we've talked about how IVAs have, both good and bad sides. It's a real balancing act. and that credit score impact. Yeah, that's a big one to think about. But let's flip the coin, look at the plus side for a sec. What are some of the advantages that might, make that credit hit worth it for some folks?
Well, on top of that legal protection from creditors, one of the big draws of an IVA is the possibility of getting some of your debt written off. Now, it's not a guarantee, but it happens a lot. At the end of the IVA term, if you've held up your end of the deal, creditors often agree to forgive part of the remaining debt.
Hold on. So you could actually walk away from the IVA owing less than you did when you started. That sounds almost too good to be true. How does that even work?
It's not magic. It's all negotiation. Remember, creditors, they want their money back as much as they can get. If they think they'll get more through the IVA than, say, if you went bankrupt, they're more likely to agree to that write-off as part of the whole thing.
So it's like a bit of a gamble for them. They're betting on the IVA being the best way to get something back, even if it's not the full amount. Interesting. Anything else? Any other advantages we haven't talked about yet?
Yeah, another big one is that you get to keep your assets with an IVA, unlike bankruptcy. Especially important if you're a homeowner. If you own your home, going bankrupt, that could mean losing it. But an IVA lets you keep your home while still, tackling the debt.
Okay, so for someone who's struggling with debt, but they've built up some assets, like a house, an IVA could be a way to protect those assets while they, get back on solid ground financially. Makes sense. But earlier you said, IVAs aren't for everyone. What about the risks, the not so fun stuff someone should know about?
Right. One risk we haven't really dug into is the chance that the IVA could fail. This can happen if your finances change and you just can't make those payments anymore. And if the IVA fails, you could end up right back where you started or even, facing bankruptcy.
So it's not like a free pass. You got to be ready to really stick to the plan, even if things get tough. Sounds kind of nerve-wracking, honestly. What happens if an IVA does fail? Are there, safety nets?
Well, what happens after a failed IVA? It really depends. Why did it fail? Are the creditors willing to, work with you? Sometimes the IP can renegotiate the terms, make it more doable, but sometimes bankruptcy might be the only option left.
So there's a lot riding on it. It sounds like having a really good support system, especially that trustworthy IP, is super important to navigate this whole thing. But let's shift gears for a second. We've been focused on the nuts and bolts of IVAs, the legal stuff, the money talk. What about the human side of this? How does going through an IVA affect people's lives, beyond just the bank account?
That's a really important point, and it doesn't get talked about enough. Dealing with debt, it can be incredibly stressful. It takes a toll. And signing up for an IVA, yeah, it might bring some relief, but it also adds a whole new layer of, complexity, uncertainty. It's not easy.
I can imagine. It's basically giving someone else control of your finances, and there's always that fear of what might happen. Are there resources for people to help them cope with that, the emotional, mental side of it?
There are, yeah. A lot of debt charities, support groups, they offer counseling, guidance to help people deal with the emotions that come with debt and going through an IVA, talking to a financial advisor or even a therapist, someone who gets debt management, that can be really helpful too.
So it's not just about numbers. It's about, the human impact of the whole journey. We've talked a lot about the IP, but how do you even find a good one? What should you be looking for?
Finding the right IP is huge. You're basically going into a partnership with this person, so you need to feel good about them, confident in what they can do, look for experience, qualifications, a good track record with IVAs. Those are the basics.
Okay, so experience matters. What about, personality? Does that matter?
Absolutely. You want someone approachable, empathetic, someone who's a good communicator. They're going to be explaining complicated stuff, negotiating with your creditors, guiding you through a potentially stressful process. You need someone you can trust, someone you can actually talk to.
Right, like finding a good doctor. You want someone who knows their stuff, but also someone who gets you and makes you feel comfortable.
Yeah.
So where do you even find these IPs? Is there, a list somewhere?
There are a few ways. The Insolvency Service in the UK, they have a register of licensed IPs.
Yeah.
You can also ask around. Financial advisors, debt charities, even friends or family who might have gone through an IVA themselves.
Word of mouth, always helpful. Any, red flags to watch out for when you're choosing an IP?
Definitely. If someone's promising guaranteed results or pushing you to sign up before you really understand everything, that's a red flag. A good IP is going to be honest, even if that means telling you that an IVA isn't the right move for you.
Good point. They should be on your side, not just trying to, get you to sign on the dotted line. What about fees? Who pays the IP and how much does it cost?
Usually the fees are built into your monthly payments, so no big upfront costs. The exact amount depends on your situation, how complex it is, and the IP's fees. But all of that is laid out in the IVA proposal before you sign anything.
Okay, transparency is key. You got to know what you're getting into financially. What if you're already in an IVA and you're just not happy with your IP? Can you switch to a different one?
You can, yeah. But it's not a simple thing. You need a good reason for switching, and the new IP has to agree to take on your case. It's not something to do lightly, but it is possible if there are, serious problems with our current IP.
So good to know there's, some options if things aren't working out.
Let's zoom out a bit, though. We've been focusing on IVAs as a solution for individuals, but how do they fit into the whole, debt management picture in the UK?
IVAs, they're just one tool in the toolbox. They're part of this whole system that includes things like debt management plans, debt consolidation loans, even bankruptcy. It's all connected.
So it's not one size fits all. It's about finding the right tool for the job. What about the government? Does the UK government have any say in, regulating IVAs or helping people who are struggling?
They do, yeah. The Insolvency Service, we mentioned them before, they're a government agency. They oversee the whole insolvency profession, make sure IPs are following the rules, and they also provide info and resources to help people understand their options when it comes to debt.
So there's a safety net, a system in place to protect people going through this. That's good to know. What about the creditors, though? Do they actually benefit from agreeing to an IVA? They often do, yeah. Financially, it makes sense for them a lot of the time. They know that if you're really struggling, they might not see a penny if you declare bankruptcy. An IVA gives them a shot at getting at least some of their money back, even if it takes longer or involves some compromises.
Right, a pragmatic approach. Everyone's trying to make the best of a tough situation. Do creditors ever feel, resentful, though, having to accept less than what's owed?
That's a tough one. Creditors are businesses, right? They know that lending money always comes with some risk. They might not be happy about getting less, but they often see an IVA as a better outcome than a total loss.
So it's more of a business decision than a personal one. We've covered a lot about IVAs today, from how they work to, the human side of things. But before we wrap up, what about the future of IVAs? With the economy changing and all the new technology, do you think IVAs are going to stick around?
That's a really interesting question. How we manage debt, it's constantly changing. And IVAs will probably have to adapt. We might see more online platforms, digital tools, things that make the process easier, more accessible.
So the idea might stay the same, but the way it's done could look pretty different. What about artificial intelligence? Could AI have a role in IVAs down the line?
It's possible. AI could help with some of the administrative stuff, analyzing financial data, maybe even predicting whether an IVA is likely to succeed. But the human side of it, the IP, understanding each person's situation and working with the creditors, that's probably always going to be important.
So it's not about replacing people with robots. It's about using tech to make things better.
Interesting.
But let's come back to the here and now. For someone listening to this, feeling overwhelmed by debt, thinking about their options, what's the one thing they should take away from all of this?
The most important thing is, if you're struggling, don't keep it to yourself. Don't suffer in silence. There's help out there. An IVA might be an option, it might not, but talk to someone, get advice, understand what you can do. Knowledge is power, and knowing what your options are, that's the first step towards taking control of your money.
Solid advice. Don't freak out, get help, and see what's out there. But an IVA, it's a big decision with pros and cons. It's not a magic bullet, but it can be a really valuable tool to get your finances back on track. And with that, let's move on to some final thoughts on this deep dive into the world of IVAs.
Man, we've really unpacked IVAs today. Way more to it than I realized. So much to think about. Finding the right IP, those long-term impacts, it's a lot.
Yeah, not a decision to make on a whim, that's for sure. It's a powerful tool, no doubt, but you got to know what you're getting into. Benefits, drawbacks, the whole 9 yards.
And that's what makes this deep dive so valuable. I mean, you guys sent us this source. You want to know how this stuff actually works, how it could affect you personally, right? Yeah, absolutely. We're not just reading the dictionary definition here. We're talking credit scores, IPs, even the emotional roller coaster of being in debt. It all matters.
And that emotional part, it got me thinking. We keep using these phrases like get back on track or financial health. It's almost like we're talking about our physical well-being when we talk about money.
Huh. That's interesting. And it makes sense though. Debt, it weighs on people, right? messes with your head, your emotions, just as much as your bank account. It's people's lives we're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. So even though an IVA can be like a practical solution, we got to remember the human side of it, the stress, the anxiety that comes with debt.
Yeah.
It's real.
Couldn't agree more. And that's where getting support is so important. Financial advisor, a debt charity, even a therapist sometimes. You don't have to go through this alone.
So for our listener who's been hanging on every word, like the most important thing to remember out of all of this.
If you're drowning in debt, reach out. Talk to someone. There's help out there, people who can guide you, help you make good decisions. The more you know, the better. Understanding your options, that's the first step to getting back in control.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
Don't panic. Get help. See what's possible. IVAs, they're a big commitment with good and bad sides. Not a magic solution, but it can be a powerful way to get your finances back on solid ground.
And with that wraps up our deep dive into IVAs. Hope you found it useful, insightful, maybe even a little bit inspiring. You're not alone on this journey. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep working towards a brighter financial future. Thanks for joining us.